Welcome to Card Corner. These are the cards. That's the corner. Today I've got these Hobbit cards. It's basically the whole story one by one. I did a read through of them already. I'm going to play that at the end of the video, but that one was a little bit long, so I just wanted to go through them one by one, just the art to show you guys first, and then I'll play that video. You can tap it whenever you like. Got the Hobbits. There's Bilbo Baggins. I think that's one of my favorite cards in the set. Gandalf, another great card. Very few character cards in the set. They're mostly moments in the story. Got some dwarves. That treasure behind them. They're mining right behind the throne of their king. You'd think he could find a better place to sit. Got some trolls. Roasting a pig or something. A nice pickle. Look at that messy room. A short rest. This is the Elves of Rivendell. Moon letters. This is when Elrond is telling them about the swords they get from the goblins. Over hill and under hill. Oh, this is where they're running away from the goblins. Great Goblin. Pretty good Great Goblin character card. A turning point. This is where Bilbo gets his ring. Riddles in the Dark. I really like the way that they portray Gollum in this one. A magic ring. This is probably the least interesting picture in the set. Out of the frying pan, hiding from wolves. And into the fire, rescued by eagles. Here we got Queer Lodgings. Mirkwood. Got some spiders. The Wood Elves. Barrels Out of Bond. I didn't really like these movies they made with, there was 3 of them, shorter than Lord of the Rings, and then they made it like longer. But the one part that really sticks out is when they're in those barrels in that film. It is pretty ridiculous. A Warm Welcome. On the Doorstep. Got that key, little keyhole. Smaug. Another character card. Inside Information. Another dragon. Not at Home. Counting some gold. The First Payment. Fire and Water. The dragon attacking the town. It's a pretty cool picture. Bard. Very comic booky sort of style here with the different panels. Gathering of the Clouds. They're all marching to go to war. This is the siege when all the men and the elves want a cut of the dragon gold. The Clouds Burst. The Battle of 5 Armies. Not a character card, but I like this one a lot. Art's really intricate and detailed. To part in friendship. The return journey. And the last stage. Also came with this, it's like other sets they released. They got a Crime and Punishment set, famous comic book creators set, True Crime 2. Looks like they do some Hellraiser cards, Rock Bottom Award trading cards. Not sure about those. Anyway, I just wanted to run through these because my reading of the backs, you can see the backs are very long. This video is going to take some time. So if you want to sit back, relax, maybe you're getting ready to go to bed, my droning voice will send you to dreamland. Without further ado, I'll send it to me in the past. Welcome to Card Corner. These are the cards. That's the corner. Today I've got these The Hobbit set of 36 color cards. I picked these up at a card show a little while ago, and I thought it would be cool to show you guys. I really like it when stuff that is for Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit are from before the movies came out. It seems like after the movies came out, that's sort of what they would default to whenever making supplementary media. But I think that it's cool to check out some of these imaginations of the franchise that came before we had Peter Jackson's version. It's by Eclipse Enterprise. I paid a little bit more than $11.75 for them. And looks like they're from 1992. Copyright The Estate of J.R.R. Tolkien. Based on The Hobbit from 1965. The Hobbit was definitely a book that I liked a lot when I was younger. It was probably my favorite book that I read before I went to high school. I read the Hobbit in probably like grade 7. I really like how it's like sort of split into these different chapters, and you can kind of read it in small sittings. It makes it good to read before bed. Here we get the Hobbits. Plain, quiet folk. Hobbits live in holes in the ground, not nasty, dirty, wet holes filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet dry, bare, sandy holes with nothing in them to sit down on or to eat. They live in hobbit holes, and that means comfort. Their doors are perfectly round with a knob in the exact middle. It opens onto a tube-shaped hall like a tunnel with paneled walls and floors tiled and carpeted, and many little round doors opening out of it, first on one side, then on another. No going upstairs for a hobbit. Bedrooms, bathrooms, cellars, pantries, lots of these, wardrobes, kitchens, dining rooms, all are on the same floor, and indeed on the same passage. What is a hobbit? I suppose hobbits need some description nowadays, since they have become rare and shy of the big people, as they call us. Hobbits are, or were, a little people, smaller than the bearded dwarves. Hobbits have no beards. There is little or no magic about them, except the ordinary everyday sort, which helps them to disappear quietly and quickly. They are inclined to be fat in the stomach. They dress in bright colors, wear no shoes, because their feet grow naturally leathery soles, and thick warm brown hair like the stuff on their heads, which is curly. Have long, clever brown fingers, good-natured faces, and laugh deep, fruity laughs, especially after dinner, which they have twice a day when they can get it. They are plain, quiet folk who have no use for the disturbances of those outside their own country. All right, next up we got Bilbo Baggins smoking something on that pipe there. a very fine person. Bilbo Baggins was a very well-to-do hobbit. He lived in the most luxurious hobbit hole that was to be found either under the hill, as all the people for many miles round called it, or over the hill, or across the water, the small river that ran at the foot of the hill, and he was fond of visitors. The Bagginses were considered very respectable, not only because most of them are rich, but also because they never had any adventures or did anything unexpected. You could tell what a Baggins would say on any question without the bother of asking him. The mother of Bilbo Baggins was the fabulous Belladonna Took, one of the three remarkable daughters of the old Took, head of the hobbits who lived across the water. The Tooks had something not entirely hobbit-like about them, and once in a while members of the Took clan would go and have adventures. Though the Tooks were not as respectable as the Bagginses, they were undoubtedly richer. It is probable that Bilbo, although he looked and behaved exactly like his father, got something a bit queer in his makeup from the Took side, something that only waited for a chance to come out. The chance never arrived until Bilbo was grown up, being about 50 years old or so, and had apparently settled down immovably. When Bilbo was chosen by Gandalf to go on an adventure, he found himself doing and saying things altogether unexpected. All right, next up we have Gandalf. Pretty sweet Gandalf card. The Wandering Wizard. One morning, in the quiet of the world, Gandalf paid Bilbo a visit. Gandalf, to hear only a very little of all there is to hear about Gandalf is enough to prepare one for any sort of remarkable tale. Tales and adventures sprout up all over the place wherever he goes, in the most extraordinary fashion. Gandalf had not been down that way under the hill for ages and ages, and the hobbits had almost forgotten what he looked like. All that the unsuspecting Bilbo saw was an old man with a staff who made it known that he was looking for someone to share in an adventure. Bilbo did his best to get rid of him, but then Gandalf identified himself, and a host of memories leapt into Bilbo's mind. Not the wandering wizard who gave Old Took a pair of magic diamond studs that fastened themselves and never came undone till ordered. Not the fellow who used to tell such wonderful tales at parties about dragons and goblins and princesses and widows' sons. Not the man who used to make such particularly excellent fireworks. Not the Gandalf who is responsible for so many quiet lads and lasses going off into the blue for mad adventure. Anything from climbing trees to visiting elves or sailing ships, sailing to other shores. Amused Gandalf chose Bilbo for his adventure. Bilbo declined and tried to leave without being rude, but in doing so he inadvertently invited Gandalf to tea the next day. All right, next up is An Unexpected Party. Though Bilbo was so flustered with Gandalf that he inadvertently invited him to tea, he was positively flummoxed the next day when 13 dwarves preceded Gandalf into his home and made themselves comfortable. The dwarves were Dwalin, Balin, Keely, Feely, Dori, Nori, Ori, Owen, Glowin, Biffer, Boffer, Bomber, and the great Thorin Oakenshield. After hours of eating, storytelling, and singing, which woke up something tookish in Bilbo, he learned that Gandalf had chosen him to act as the burglar in the dwarves' expedition to recover their treasure, which had been stolen by the dragon Smaug. Gandalf gave Thorin a small key and a map made by Thorin's grandfather Thor, which told of a secret door to the Lonely Mountain whereby they might be able to avoid the dragon's jaws, although the location and means of opening the door remained a mystery. Gandalf had received these items from Thorin's late father Thrain, whom he had discovered being held prisoner in the dungeons of the necromancer. Next morning, Bilbo was relieved to find the dwarves had gone on without him, until Gandalf walked in and showed him an unnoticed letter resting on the mantel. The letter offered Bilbo 1/14th share of total profits, if any, for his professional assistance. Allowing him no time for thought, Gandalf sent Bilbo racing to overtake the dwarves, and soon caught up himself. That's how they all came to start jogging off one fine morning just before May on laden ponies. All right, next up is Dwarves and the Lonely Mountain. The Lonely Mountain was discovered by Thorin's far ancestor, Thrain the Old. In the time of Thorin's grandfather, Thror, his family was driven out of the far north, and they came back to the mountain. They built hunger halls and greater workshops, and they found a good deal of gold and a great many jewels. They grew immensely rich, and Thror was king under the mountain, and was treated with great reverence by the mortal men who lived to the south and who built the merry town of Dale. Kings used to send for the dwarves smiths and reward even the least skillful most richly. Those were the good old days for the dwarves, and the halls became full of armor and jewels and carvings and cups. Undoubtedly, these riches were what brought the dragon. He was most specially greedy, strong, and wicked worm called Smaug. He settled on the mountain in a spout of flame. Smaug left no dwarves alive inside, and he took all their wealth for himself. He also destroyed the town of Dale. Thorin and Balin and others had been outside the mountain at the time of the dragon's attack. They were later joined by Thorin's father and grandfather, who had mysteriously escaped. After the dragon went away and had to earn their livings as best they could, often sinking as low as blacksmith work or even coal mining. But the dwarves never forgot their stolen treasure and always meant to get it back and to bring their curses home to Smaug. All right, next up we got Trolls and roast mutton. The party had been on the road nearly a month. It was pouring with rain, and Gandalf, unknown to them, was scouting ahead. The dwarves were trying and failing to start a fire when Balin spotted a light on a hill some ways off. They sent Bilbo, their burglar, to find out about this light. Hobbits can move absolutely quietly in the woods, so Bilbo crept right up to the fire, for fire it was, without disturbing anyone. There he saw three very large persons sitting around a very large fire, roasting mutton on a long spit of wood. But they were trolls, obviously trolls, William, Bert, and Tom. Either Bilbo should have gone back quietly and warned his friends, or else he should have done a bit of good quick burgling, for it is nearly always worthwhile to pick a troll's pocket. Bilbo knew it. He was very much alarmed, and yet somehow he could not go straight back to Thorin and company empty-handed. At last he crept behind William. He put his little hand in William's enormous pocket. There was a purse in it. But trolls' purses are the mischief, and this was no exception. "Here, who are you?" it squeaked, and William grabbed Bilbo by the neck. While being questioned, Bilbo let slip that he was with some companions. Then, as the trolls began to fight amongst themselves about whether to eat Bilbo or not, Balin stepped into the firelight, and the trolls caught him. Now the trolls were warned, and one by one each dwarf was captured as he came to investigate. Next up, we've got a nice pickle and good blades. The dwarves were now all nearly tied up in sacks, with three angry trolls arguing whether they should roast them or mince them fine and boil them, or merely sit on them and squash them into jelly. The trolls had just decided to roast the dwarves when a voice Bert thought was William's said, No good roasting 'em now. It'd take all night. Rekindling the argument. They ended by deciding to boil them when Tom apparently said, "No boiling 'em. We ain't got no water." They settled on making the dwarves into jelly, but uh, couldn't settle on who to squash first, as one of the three always restarted the argument. Before it was over, a voice sounded like William said, "Dawn take you all and be stoned to you." And just at that moment, sunlight came over the hill. William never spoke. He stood turned to stone, as were Bert and Tom, for trolls must be underground before dawn, or they go back to the stuff of the mountains they are made of. Gandalf then stepped from behind a tree and released the dwarves. Bilbo understood. It was the wizard's voice that had kept the trolls quarreling until the light came and made an end of them. They searched about and found the troll's cave. Within, they found pots of coins which they buried for later recovery, and several swords. Two particularly fine swords were taken by Gandalf and Thorin, and Bilbo took a knife in a leather sheath. When that was done, they mounted once more and jogged along again the path towards the east. A short rest. Elrond and the High Elves. Gandalf led the way through unexpected valleys that opened suddenly at their feet, gullies that they could almost leap over, and dark ravines that one could neither jump nor climb into. The path was marked with white stones, but altogether it was a very slow business. At dusk they came to the edge of a steep fall. "There it is at last," Gandalf called. Hidden on the very edge of the wild, near the feet of the misty mountains, was the fair valley of Rivendell and the last homely house. The master of the house was an elf friend, one of those people whose fathers came into the strange stories before the beginnings of history. The wars of the evil goblins and the elves and the first men in the north. There was still some people who had both elves and heroes of the north for ancestors, and Elrond was their chief. He was as noble and as fair in the face as an elf lord, as strong as a warrior and as wise as a wizard, as vulnerable as a king of dwarves, and as kind as summer. Venerable as a king of dwarves, and as kind as summer. His house was perfect, whether you like foods or sleep or work or storytelling or singing or just sitting and thinking best, or a pleasant mixture of them all. Evil things did not come into that valley. In the last homely house, the party grew refreshed and strong in a few days. Their bags were filled with food and provisions. Their plans were improved with the best advice. So the time came to Midsummer Eve, and they were to go again with the early sun on midsummer morning. Moon Letters. Goblin Cleaver and Foe Hammer. Elrond knew all about runes the day he identified the swords Gandalf and Thorin brought from the troll's lair as the very old swords of the high elves of the west, his kin. They are made in Gondolin for the goblin wars and must have come from a dragon's hoard or goblin's plunder, for dragons and goblins destroyed that city many ages ago. Thorin's sword was named Orcrist the Goblin Cleaver. Gandalf's was Glamdring, the foe hammer that the king of Gondolin once wore. The moon was shining in a broad silver crescent when Elrond held up the dwarves' map, and the white light shone through it. He found moon letters next to the plain runes describing the secret door in the mountain. Moon letters were invented by dwarves. They are rune letters, but you can see them only when the moon shines behind them, and with the more cunning sort, it must be a moon of the same shape and season as the day when they were written. Those on Thorin's map were written on a midsummer's eve in a crescent moon a long while ago, they said. Stand by the grey stone when the thrush knocks, and the setting sun with the last light of Durin's day will shine upon the keyhole. Though Thorin knew Durin's day was when the last moon of autumn and the sun were in the sky together. He admitted it past the dwarf's skill to guess when such a time will come again. The next morning was midsummer's morning, and they rode away amid songs of farewell and good speed. Over hill and under hill. Goblins. There were many passes over the misty mountains, but helped by the wise and advice of Elrond and the knowledge and memory of Gandalf, the party took the right road to the right pass. After many days climbing, a thunderstorm drove them to take shelter in a shallow cave. While they slept out, jumped goblins, great ugly-looking goblins, lots of goblins. Though Gandalf killed several goblins with a flash like lightning, the others were captured and carried into the darkness. Goblins are cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. They make no beautiful things, but they make many clever ones: hammers, axes, swords, daggers, pickaxes, tongs, and also instruments of torture. They make very well, or get other people to make their design. Prisoners and slaves that have to work till they die. It is not unlikely that they invented some of the machines that have since troubled the world, especially the ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once, for engines and explosions always delighted them. But in those days they had not advanced, as it is called, so far. They did not hate dwarves especially, no more than they hated everybody and everything. But they had a special grudge against Thorin's people. Thorin's grandfather, Thror, was killed in the mines of Moria by Azog the Goblin, which led to the Dwarf and Goblin War. And anyway, goblins don't care who they catch as long as it's done smart and secret, and the prisoners are not able to defend themselves. The Great Goblin. A tight corner. The goblins took away the ponies and supplies, then drove their captives down the tunnels to a cavern where sat the great goblin. He accused them of spying, but Thorin said they were just sheltering from the storm. One of the goblins pointed out that Thorin carried the sword Orcrist. The great goblin howled with rage and rushed at Thorin. They knew the sword. It had killed hundreds of goblins in its time. Just at that moment, all the lights went out, and the great fire went off, poof, into a tower of blue glowing smoke that scattered piercing white sparks all among the goblins. The sparks burnt holes in the goblins, and soon they were falling over one another as if they had all gone mad. Then a sword flashed in its own light and went right through the great goblin. A voice said, "Follow me, quick," and Bilbo and the dwarves trotted after. Then Gandalf lit up his wand. Of course it was Gandalf. He had led them down the goblin tunnels. At one point, Gandalf and Thorin, for whom Gandalf had retrieved Orcrist, turned and struck at the goblins with their swords. The dwarves carried Bilbo, for he could not run as fast as the others. But the goblins put out their torches and slipped on soft shoes and came up behind unnoticed. Quite suddenly, Dori, who was carrying Bilbo, was grabbed from behind in the dark. The hobbit rolled off his shoulders into the blackness, bumped his head, and remembered nothing more. A turning point. Checking out that ring there. Gollum. Bilbo awoke in the dark alone. He crept down the tunnel till suddenly his hand met what felt like a tiny ring of cold metal. He was a turning point in it was it was a turning point in his career, but he did not know it. He put the ring in his pocket almost without thinking. It was then he realized the goblins had left him his little sword that he had got from the trolls. He drew it out. It shone pale and dim like Orcrist and Glamdrig did in the presence of goblins, so Bilbo realized it was an elvish blade, too, made in Gondolin for the Goblin Wars. On and on Bilbo went. The tunnel seemed to have no end. Suddenly, without any warning, he trotted splashed into an underground lake. There are strange things living in the pools and lakes in the hearts of the mountains, fish whose fathers swam in, goodness only knows how many years ago, and never swam out again, while their eyes grew bigger and bigger and bigger from trying to see in the blackness. And also there are other things, more slimy than fish. Deep down here by the dark water lived old Gollum. When he swallowed, he made a horrible noise in his throat. Gollum. That's how he got his name, though he always called himself my precious. Gollum lived in a slimy island of rock in the middle of the lake. He had a little boat and he rowed about quite quietly on the lake. He paddled it with large feet dangling over the side, but never a ripple did he make. Not he. He was watching Bilbo with his pale eyes like telescopes. Riddles in the dark. Pretty creepy looking. 3 guesses. Gollum liked meat. Goblin he thought good when he could get it. But he took care they never found him out. He just throttled them from behind if they ever came down alone anywhere near the edge of the water, while he was prowling about. He knew Bilbo was not a goblin and shot off across the lake in his boat to find out what Bilbo was. I guess it's a choice feast, at least a tasty morsel it'd make. Gollum. Bilbo nearly jumped out of his skin when he heard Gollum's hiss in his ears, and he thrust out his sword. Gollum was anxious to appear friendly until he found out more about the sword and the Hobbit, so he proposed a game of riddles. Riddles were all he could think of. Asking them and sometimes guessing them had been the only game he had ever played, long ago before he lost all his friends and was driven away down into the dark under the mountains. If Gollum won, he would eat Bilbo, but if Bilbo won, Gollum would show him a way out. Bilbo agreed, hoping to find more about this creature. They asked each other many riddles. Finally, Bilbo ran out of riddles, and as his hand slipped into his pocket and felt the ring he had picked up, he asked aloud, "What have I got in my pocket?" Which was really a question and not a true riddle. Gollum thought this was unfair and demanded 3 guesses, but failed each time. Bilbo jumped at once to his feet, put his back to the nearest wall, held out his little sword, and insisted on now being showed the way out. All right, here we have a magic ring. Before Gollum would lead Bilbo out of the goblin tunnel, he went to get something from his island. He wanted it because it was a ring of power. If you slipped that ring on your finger, you were invisible. Who knows how Gollum came by this ring? Perhaps even the master who ruled them could not have said. Only a few hours ago, Gollum had worn it and caught a small goblin imp. Bilbo heard Gollum cursing and wailing. "Lost it is, my precious, lost, lost!" Then Gollum hissed, "What has it got in its pockets?" Just in time, Bilbo turned and ran blindly back up the dark passage, and as he put his hand in his pocket, the ring slipped on his forefinger. Suddenly he struck his toes and fell flat. In a moment Gollum was on him, but ran by, taking no notice. Cautiously, Bilbo followed Gollum. By listening to Gollum talking to himself, he guessed the nature of the ring. Gollum crouched before a tunnel that led to a lower entrance on the far side of the mountains and waited for Bilbo. Bilbo was tempted to slay him, but it was not a fair fight. Pity stayed his hand. With great courage, he leapt over Gollum and sped down the tunnel. Bilbo barely made it out of this back door as the ring for a moment came off his finger, revealing him to the goblin guards, but he put it back on and slipped out. After much wandering, he found Gandalf and the dwarves, who had fought their way out the same door earlier. Out of the frying pan. The wargs. Bilbo told the others of his adventures in the mountains, but he told them nothing about the ring. The goblins could not follow the dwarves immediately, for the sun was still up, and sunlight makes their legs wobble and their heads giddy. Still, Gandalf knew the goblins would be out after them in hundreds when the night came on, so the party moved on. They marched long after dark, passing through a pine forest, came into a clearing. Suddenly they heard a howl, then another. It was wolves gathering together. Up the trees, quick, cried Gandalf, and they went up as high as they could. The whole pack surrounded the trees, but even those evil wolves, named wargs, could not climb trees. The wargs had planned to meet with the goblins that very night to raid the woodmen who had been making their way into that land. They thought the dwarves were come to spy on them, so the wargs had no intention of letting them escape until the goblin soldiers arrived. And goblins can climb trees or cut them down. Gandalf understood their dreadful language. He gathered the pine cones together, set one alight, and threw it down among the circle of the wolves. It struck one on the back, and his coat caught fire. Then another came, and another. Soon, all about the glade, wolves were rolling over and over, setting others alight, as well as the forest. Now the goblins rushed in, and seeing what had happened, began ringing the trees where the dwarves were with fire. Into the fire. The eagles. The Lord of the Eagles heard the wolves' voices and swept up into the air immediately. He had eyes that could look at the sun unblinking and could see a rabbit moving on the ground a mile below, even in the moonlight. So though he could not see the people in the trees, he could make out the commotion coming among the wolves and see the tiny flashes of fire. Eagles are not kindly, but the ancient race of northern mountains were the greatest of all birds. They were proud and strong and noble-hearted. They did not love goblins or fear them. The flames were under Gandalf's tree. In a moment they were spread to the others. Gandalf climbed to the top of his tree. Then sudden splendor flashed from his wand like lightning, and he got ready to spring down right among the spears of the goblins, but he never leaped. Just at that moment, the Lord of the Eagles swept down, seized him in his talons, and was gone. Other birds flew to the treetops and seized the dwarves and flew them to a wide shelf of rock on the mountainside. Bilbo was afraid he'd be eaten by the eagles, but they were friendly, for Gandalf had once healed the Lord of the Eagles from an arrow wound. The eagles brought rabbits, hares, and a small sheep to feed the hungry party. The next morning they flew the dwarves down to the river and bade them farewell. And though the Lord of the Eagles became in after days the king of all birds, Bilbo never saw the eagles again, except high and far off in the battle of the five armies. Queer lodgings. Bjorn. The eagles left the dwarves on a huge rock in the great river. Gandalf said the rock was called the Carrack by Bjorn, who had cut steps down its side. As he led them to Bjorn's house, he told them, Bjorn is a skin changer. When he changes his skin, sometimes he's a huge black bear, sometimes he is a great strong man. Some say that he is a bear descended from the great and ancient bears of the Misty Mountains. Others say he is a man descended from the first men who lived before dragons came into this part of the world and before the goblins came out of the north. He's under no enchantment but his own. He has a great wooden house, and as a man he keeps cattle and horses which are nearly as marvelous as himself. They work for him and talk to him. He does not eat them, neither does he hunt or eat wild animals. He keeps hives and hives of great fierce bees, and lives most on cream and honey. As a bear, he ranges far and wide. Because Bjorn was easily angered, Gandalf introduced the dwarves in small groups as he recounted their travails. Bjorn invited them to stay the night. His ponies served supper. The next day, Bjorn spent verifying Gandalf's story, and once done, he gave the party food and supplies for their journey. He advised them not to use the forest road through Mirkwood, but to ride north, for at a place a few days' ride north due north was a large gate of a little-known pathway through Mirkwood that led almost straight towards the Lonely Mountain. Mirkwood. Don't leave the path. Days followed days under Mirkwood's forest roof. Its tree trunks were huge and gnarled. Their leaves were dark and long. The group's food was getting low when a dark running water crossed their path. Bjorn had warned that they should neither drink nor bathe in it, for it carries enchantment and a great drowsiness and forgetfulness. Bilbo spotted a boat on the far bank, and with some difficulty they were able to pull it over with a rope and a hook. They ferried across, but as Bombur was getting out of the boat, a deer charged into the dwarves, knocking Bombur into the water. They rescued him, but found him fast asleep, and he would not awaken. They had no choice but to continue carrying him. He awoke a week later, remembering nothing since Bilbo's party, and a marvelous dream of a woodland king and a great feast. Now they were out of food, so when they saw lights in the forest, they left the path, against Bjorn's strict advice. They found elvish-looking folk at a great feast, but when they stepped forward, the lights went out as if by magic. Later, the lights reappeared in a different place. The dwarves crept forward, and the same thing happened. Bilbo, the first to step out, was found afterwards sound asleep, but he woke. The third time they saw the lights, they were hungry enough to try again. Thorin stepped out alone, and the lights went out. Bilbo ran around in the dark, unable to find the dwarfs, whose voices got farther away. He had no choice but to wait alone until daylight. I always liked that part of the story. Flies and spiders. A sting has he. Bilbo awoke from his sleep to find a great spider tying him while he dozed. He remembered his sword and struck with it right in the spider's eye and killed it. This accomplishment, alone and unaided, made Bilbo feel much bolder, and he named his sword Sting. After he slipped on his ring and headed in the direction from which he thought the dwarves' cries had come in the previous night. He soon found the dwarves hanging from a high tree branch, all bound in bundles of spiderweb. He could hear the loathsome spiders' voices, a thin creaking and hissing as they talked about killing the dwarves. Bilbo had to do something. He threw 2 stones and 2 spiders fell dead. Bilbo was a pretty fair shot. The spiders rushed down in the direction the stones were thrown from, but Bilbo, being invisible, stepped aside. In this way, by throwing stones and taunting the spiders, he led them far away. He then raced back to the trees where the dwarves hung. Using Sting, Bilbo cut the dwarves free, but not before the spiders returned. He then had no choice but to let the dwarves in on the secret of his ring. As invisible again, he attacked the spiders, killing a great many with Sting. and leading the rest away from the darkness. Finally, the spiders gave up and went back to their dark colony. The dwarves now looked to Bilbo to answer their questions of where they were, was there any food, and what would they do next. That's when they noticed Thorin was missing. The Wood Elves. One last effort. You remember Bilbo falling asleep as he stepped into the feaster's light? The next time Thorin had stepped forward and he fell like a stone enchanted. The adventure with the spiders passed him over unheard. Then the wood elves had come to him and carried him away. The feasters were wood elves, of course. They differed from the high elves and were more dangerous and less wise, for most of them were descended from the ancient tribes that never went to ferry in the west. Still elves they were, and that is good people. At this time lived their greatest king, so to his cave they dragged Thorin, for they thought he was an enemy. In ancient days they had wars with some of the dwarves, whom they accused of stealing their treasure. The dwarves had a different account, and Thorin's family had had nothing to do with the old quarrel. The king asked Thorin many questions, but Thorin was determined that no word of treasure should be dragged out of him, and would only say that he was starving. So the elves shut him in one of the inmost dungeons. Bilbo and the other dwarves were making one last effort to find a way out of the forest before they died of hunger. Suddenly, wood elves leapt out with their bows and led the dwarves to their king. Bilbo popped his ring and followed. The elven king got no more out of the 12 dwarves than out of Thorin, so he ordered each to be put in a separate cell until one at least was willing to tell him what he wanted. Barrels out of bond. Down the forest river. Bilbo lived a weary long time in the Elven King's palace, never daring to take off his ring. After a week or two of sneaking, he managed to find out where each dwarf was kept, and what was his surprise to overhear some of the guards talking about another dwarf in prison, too. It was Thorin, and after a while he managed to have a word with him, so it was that Bilbo was able to take secretly Thorin's message to each of the other imprisoned dwarves, telling them that no one was to reveal their errand to the king. One day Bilbo discovered that a stream flowed under the palace and joined the forest river. At one point where it passed under the caves, the roof had been cut away and covered with great oaken trapdoors. There in the cellar stood barrels and barrels and barrels, for the wood elves traded with the men in Lake Town, and a great deal of traffic passed up and down the stream. That night a feast was planned, and the chief guard and the butler had a private party in the cellar and soon slept from drinking too much potent wine. Bilbo lifted the cell keys from the guard and released the dwarves. He stuffed them into the empty barrels that would be dropped into the stream, only just in time. Elves came and pushed the barrels into the stream. Bilbo, with his ring on, jumped in at the last moment. The barrels floated down the stream to the river, where the other elves made a raft of them and floated them to Lake Town. A warm welcome. Lake Town. The forest river emptied into the long lake, and near its mouth was Lake Town. It was not built on the shore, but right out on the surface of the lake. A great bridge made of wood ran out from the shore to where the huge piles made of forest trees was built the great town of men who dared dwell under the shadow of the distant Dragon Mountain. Bilbo released Thorin, and the two unpacked the rest of the dwarves. While the others rested, Bilbo, Thorin, Fili, and Kili went up to Lake Town, where a feast was in progress. The guards asked who they were, and Thorin insisted that they be taken to the master of the town. Once at the feast, he proclaimed, I am Thorin, son of Thrain, son of Thor king under the mountain. I return. All leapt to their feet. The master was doubtful, but the news spread quickly from the hall through all the town. People began to sing snatches of old songs concerning the return of the king under the mountain, and the master saw that there was nothing else for it but to obey the general clamor. At the end of a fortnight, Thorin asked the master for help with their journey. The master was surprised and a little frightened, and he wondered if Thorin was, after all, really a descendant of the old king. But it was not sorry at all to let them go. They were expensive to keep. He supplied them with provisions and boats, and sent ponies round by circuitous paths to meet them at the appointed place on the running river, which emptied into the north end of the long lake. On the doorstep. A riddle solved. The dwarves reached the skirts of the mountain and scouted the front gate and the ruined town of Dale without meeting any sign of the dragon other than the wilderness he had made about his lair. Bilbo borrowed Thorin's map and pondered over the ruins and the message of the moon letters. It was he that made the dwarves begin the dangerous search on the western slopes for the secret door. Day by day they came back to their camp without success. But at last they found what they were seeking, a flat wall as smooth as mason's work, high up in the little steep-walled grassy bay. But though they thrust and pushed at the door, nothing stirred. They moved their camp up to the grassy bay and for days waited, mostly for Bilbo to do something. As the sun sank in the west, Bilbo saw a thin new moon above the rim of the earth. At that moment, Bilbo heard a sharp crack. There against a stone in the grass was an enormous thrush knocking a snail it had caught. Suddenly Bilbo understood. He called the dwarves to him and explained. They watched as the sun sank into a belt of reddened cloud. A red ray of the sun escaped through a rent in the cloud, and a gleam of light fell straight on the smooth rock face. There was a loud crack. A hole appeared about 3 feet from the ground. Quickly, Thorin put a key that went with the map into the hole. It fit and it turned. Snap! Now they all pushed together, and slowly a part of the rock wall gave way. Alright, here's Smaug hoarding his gold. Thieves, fire, murder. For a long time, the dwarves stood in the dark before the door until Thorin pointed out that this was the time for Bilbo to perform his service. The most that can be said for the dwarves is this. They intended to pay Bilbo really handsomely, and had brought him to do a nasty job for them, and they did not mind the poor little fellow doing it if he would. In the end, though, Balin came some way down the tunnel. Bilbo slipped on his ring and crept down the passageway alone. At the other end of the tunnel there was a great glow, the glow of Smaug. There he lay, a vast red golden dragon, fast asleep. Beneath him lay countless piles of precious things, gold wrought and unwrought, gems and jewels and silver. On the wall were coats of mail, helm, and swords. To say Bilbo's breath was taken away is no description at all. Quietly, Bilbo crept from the doorway to the sleeping dragon. He grasped a great cup and fled back up the passageway. The dwarves were still congratulating Bilbo for his successful theft when the mountain rumbled. Smaug was awake and he missed his cup. Dragons may not have much real use for all their wealth, but they know it to an ounce as a rule. He raged and paced description. His rage passed description. Such a thing had not happened since he came to the mountain. He issued from the front gate and licked the mountain sides with his flame. The dwarves heard the awful rumor of his flight and hid in the tunnel and escaped Smaug's searching eye. Inside information. The next morning, Bilbo offered to go down the tunnel again with hopes that something would turn up. Smaug looked asleep, but when Bilbo peeped from the entrance, he opened his eyes. He couldn't see Bilbo, but he could smell him. Bilbo engaged Smaug with riddling talk, which no dragon can resist, naming himself Ring Winner and Barrel Rider. Smaug's wily dragon talk made Bilbo doubt the dwarf's plans. He feared he would never get his share of the treasure home. But by flattering Smaug, Bilbo maneuvered him into unknowingly revealing a bare patch in the diamond armor of his left breast. When Bilbo returned to the dwarves, he told them of all he could remember. The thrush seemed to listen to all he said, and then it flew away. The dwarves assured Bilbo they never thought about what would happen after the treasure had been won, and Thorin promised Bilbo he could choose his own share. Bilbo insisted they take refuge inside the tunnel. They spent the whole day talking of the treasure. Night fell, and Bilbo convinced the dwarves to shut the door to the tunnel only just in time. Smaug had crept out of his lair and quietly searched the mountain for the thief. He found nobody, and in his rage he smote the side of the mountain where he guessed the outlet of the tunnel must be, caving in the tunnel end. Smaug knew that whether or not Barrel Rider was a man of the lake, he at least had their help, and so rose in fire and went away towards Lake Town. Not at home. The Arkenstone of Thrain. After days and days of waiting, as it seemed, Bilbo convinced the dwarves to head down the tunnel. They had heard nothing of the dragon since he crushed the door end of the tunnel, and they were not sure if there was a dragon at the other end or not. Down, down they went, but only darkness met them. Torches were lit, and though there was no dragon in sight, Thorin carefully explained to Bilbo that he was still officially their expert burglar. It was his job to scout while they waited in the tunnel for his report. Bilbo set off across the great hall, holding his tiny light aloft. He climbed a great mound of treasure, and there he saw the Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain, a gem which Thorin had described to him. The Arkenstone of Thrain was like a globe with 1,000 facets. It shone like silver in the firelight, like water in the sun. Suddenly, Bilbo's arm went towards it, drawn by the enchantment, and he put it in his deepest pocket. Now I'm a burglar indeed, he thought, but I suppose I must tell the dwarves about it sometime. The dwarves finally crept out of the tunnel, torches in hand, and mere fleeting glimpses of treasure rekindled all their fire of their dwarvish hearts. All were now eager to explore the hall. They cried out to one another as they lifted old treasures from the mound and held them in the light. Thorin was not least among these. Always he searched for the Arkenstone, but he spoke of it yet to no one. The first payment. The dwarves took down mail and weapons from the walls and armed themselves. Bilbo was given a small coat of mail wrought for some young elf prince long ago. It was of silver steel, which the elves call mithril, and with it went a belt of pearls and crystals, and a light leather helm. Bilbo reminded the dwarves that they were not yet looking for gold, but for a way to escape, and that Smaug might return any moment. Thorin led them up countless stairs and out the front gate where the running river issued forth. Then Balin took them on a long march to the old lookout post, Ravenhill, at the southwest corner of the mountain. After going a short way, they rested and had such a breakfast as they could, chiefly cram and water. If you want to know what cram is, I can only say I do not know the recipe, but it is a biscuitish, keeps good indefinitely, is supposed to be sustaining, and is certainly not entertaining, being in fact very uninteresting except as a chewing exercise. It was made by the lake men for long journeys. After that they went on again, till they came to the top of the ridge. Here they found a flat piece blackened by a rocky face. Here they found a flat place backed by a rocky face in which there was an opening like a door. Watchmen used to be kept on the side Watchmen used to be kept on the ridge, and the rock-hewn chamber behind the door was made as a guard-room. In the rock chamber some threw themselves down at once and once slept, but the others discussed their plans. In all their talk they came perpetually back to one thing: where was Smaug? Fire and water. The dragon attacks. While the dwarves crouched in the tunnel under the mountain for the second night, the men of the lake town Esgaroth were watching lights start and fade on the mountain. Suddenly, the northern end of the lake turned golden, and some men shouted, "The king beneath the mountain, his rivers golden run," for they believed the old prophecies were coming true. But one grim-voiced fellow, Bard was his name, ran hotfoot to the master, crying, "The dragon is coming, or I am a fool. Cut the bridges. To arms, to arms." So it was that the dragon did not find them quite so unprepared. Every vessel in town was filled with water, every warrior armed, and the bridge to land was thrown down and destroyed. Smaug was foiled. Lake Town was built in deep water, and if he plunged into it, the lake would squelch him before he could pass through. A hail of dark arrows leapt up and snapped and rattled on his scales. The dragon's wrath blazed to its height. No fireworks you ever imagined equaled the sights that night. Fire leapt from the dragon's jaws. Bard cheered on the archers, who would have run without his example. Flames unquenchable sprang high into the night. Men were jumping into the water. Women and children were being huddled into boats. The master was hoping to row away in the confusion and save himself. Soon all the town would be deserted and burned down to the surface of the lake. All right, here we have Bard, the dragon shooter. Lake Town was ablaze, but there was still a company of archers that held their ground among the burning houses. Their captain was Bard, grim-voiced and grim-faced. He was a descendant in long line of Gurion, Lord of Dale. Now he shot with a great yellow yew bow, till all his arrows but one were spent. The flames were near him. He bent his bow for the last time. Suddenly, out of the dark, an old thrush perched by his ear and brought him news. Marveling, he found he could understand its tongue, for he was of the race of Dale, who have the trick of understanding their language. "Wait, wait," it said to him. "Look for the hollow of the left breast as he flies and turns above you." And while Bard paused to wonder, it told him of tidings up in the mountain and of all that it had heard. Then Bard drew his bowstring to his ear. "Black Arrow," he said, the bowman, "I have saved you to the last. I had you for my father, and he from of old. If ever you came from the forges of the true king under the mountain, go now and speed well." The dragon's belly glittered white, but not in one place. The great bow twanged. The black arrow sped straight for the hollow by the left breast. In it smote and vanished, barb, shaft, and feather. With a shriek that deafened men, Smaug shot spouting into the air, turned over, crashed down full on the town. The lake roared in. There was a hiss, a gushing wind, and then silence. And that was the end of Smaug and Esgaroth, but not of Bard. Bit of a different look on that one. Gathering of the Clouds. March to the mountain. The survivors of Esgaroth lamented the loss of their town. The people tried to make Bard their king because he had stayed to defend their town when the master fled. Bard declined, intending to return someday to Dale now that the dragon was dead. And though the days of sickness and hunger followed, the people of Lake Town all talked of the vast treasure that was now unguarded, for they assumed the dwarves had perished. Bard sent to the elven king for aid, but found a host already on the move, because tidings that Smaug was dead had spread far and wide. Bjorn had heard it in his house, and the goblins were at council in their caves. The elven host provided provisions and assistance to the people of the lake, and after 11 days, a host of men and elves marched north to the mountain. On Raven Hill, the thrush could not make the dwarves understand him, so he found Roak, a raven, for ravens could speak ordinary language. There used to be a great friendship between the ravens and the people of Thror. Roak told the dwarves that Smaug was dead and that the host was approaching the mountain, drawn by the legend of the wealth of Thror. Thanking Roak, Thorin asked him to send word to his cousin Dane in the Iron Hills to hasten to the mountain and bring news of arriving hosts. Then the dwarves hurried back to the mountain, fortified the front gate, and altered the riverbed so that a wide pool stretched before the gate. The Siege. A thief in the night. Very great were the two hosts surprised to see the gate blocked with a wall of new hewn stone. Thorin demanded that the hosts state their purpose. Bard asked for a parley, for it was by his hand that the dragon was slain. Moreover, he was by right descendant of the heir. Moreover, he was by right descendant the heir of Girion of Dale, and the dwarves' hoard was mingled so much of the wealth of that town. Further, Smaug destroyed the dwellings of the men Esgaroth who aided the dwarves in their distress. Now Bard's words were fair and true, but the lust of treasure was heavy on Thorin, and he answered that he would pay the lakemen for the assistance, but nothing will we give, not even a loaf's worth, under the threat of force. Thereafter, in the name of Esgaroth and the forest, Thorin was commanded to deliver 1/12 portion of the treasure unto Bard, from which portion Bard would contribute to the aid of Esgaroth. Thorin refused, and the mountains was besieged. The days passed slowly and wearily, and one night Bilbo made up his mind. Offering to take Bomber's turn at watch, he sneaked out of the mountain and entered the camp below the gate. There, willing to let it stand against all his claim, Bilbo turned over the Arkenstone to Bard and the Elven King to aid them in their bargaining. Bilbo also warned them of Dane approaching from the Iron Hills. Unexpectedly, Gandalf appeared. He told Bilbo to keep his heart up and sent him, puzzled but cheered, back to the mountain. The clouds burst. Dane has come. Next day, another embassy hailed Thorin, this time in exchange for their share of the treasure they offered to trade the Arkenstone of Thrain. Thorin was stricken dumb with amazement. When Bilbo confessed of having given the Arkenstone to them, Thorin was ready to throw Bilbo over the wall. Only Gandalf revealing himself in the embassy saved him. Bilbo was let down the wall, and in return for the Arkenstone, Thorin agreed to hand over 1/14 share of the hoard in silver and gold, that being accounted the promised share of this traitor. The Raven messengers told Dane of these events, and he came with 500 dwarves with wary speed. Bard, of course, refused to allow the dwarves to go straight onto the mountain, for he did not believe that Thorin would deliver the promised gold and silver once the fortress was manned with so large and warlike a company. They had brought with them a great store of supplies. They would stand a siege for weeks, but he reckoned without the dwarves. The knowledge that the Arkenstone was in the hands of the besiegers burned in their thoughts. Suddenly, without a signal, bows twanged and arrows whistled. Still more suddenly, a blackness came from the north. Halt, cried Gandalf, in a voice like thunder. The goblins are upon you. Amazement and confusion fell upon them all, and Gandalf quickly called a council between the elves, the men, and Dane's dwarves. Battle of Five Armies. It's a pretty cool one. Other quarrels forgotten. So began the battle of five armies that none had expected. Upon one side were the goblins and the wild wolves, and upon the other were elves and men and dwarves. This is how it fell out. The goblins, to revenge the death of the great goblin, resolved to win the dominion of the north. They gathered beneath Gundabad Mountain, ready to sweep down upon the south. Then they learned of the death of Smaug and hastened their journey, arriving hard on the heels of Dane. The elves sent on the southern spur of the mountain, men and dwarves on the eastern spur, on either side of the front gate. The goblin army poured into the valley between. It was a terrible battle, the most dreadful of all Bilbo's experiences. He put on his ring early and vanished from sight, if not from all danger. First the elves charged, then the dwarves. Victory seemed at hand when the goblins that had scaled the mountain from the other side attacked from above. Suddenly, part of the wall before the gate fell outward with a crash. Out leapt Thorin and his companions. Wolf and rider fell and fled before them. Thorin dove right against the bodyguards of Bolg, son of Azog, but his numbers were too few. His flanks were unguarded. Soon the attackers were attacked. On all this Bilbo looked with misery. Then he gave a great cry. He had seen a sight that made his heart leap. The eagles are coming, cried Bilbo. But at that moment a stone smote heavily on his helm, and he fell and knew no more. To part in friendship. The death of Thorin Oakenshield. Bilbo awoke long after the Battle of Five Armies was over. His ring saved him from real harm, but it also prevented him from being discovered. He removed it, and a soldier carried him to the Lakemen's camp. There Gandalf greeted him and escorted him to Thorin's tent, for he had been called for. There inside lay Thorin Oakenshield, wounded with many wounds. I wish to part in friendship, he told Bilbo. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. And he bade Bilbo farewell. Then Bilbo went by himself and sat alone and wept until his eyes were red. Bilbo later learned how the eagles had dislodged the goblins from the mountain slopes, which freed elves and men to come at last to help those battling in the valley. In the last hour, Bjorn himself had appeared in a bear's shape. He tossed wolves and goblins from his path like straws. Then Bjorn lifted Thorin, who had fallen pierced with spears, and bore him out of the fray. Swiftly he returned and scattered the bodyguard and pulled down Bolg himself and crushed him. Then dismay fell on the goblins, and they fled in all directions. Thorin was buried deep in the mountain, and Bard laid the Arkenstone upon his breast. Upon his tomb the elven king laid Orcrist, the elvish sword that had been taken from Thorin in captivity. It is said in songs that it gleamed ever in the dark if foes approached, and the fortress of dwarves could not be taken by surprise. The Return Journey. And retraced steps. Of the 12 companions of Thorin, 10 remained. Fili and Kili had fallen defending him with shield and body, for he was their mother's elder brother. The others remained with Dane who was now king under the mountain, for Dane dealt his treasure well. There was, of course, no longer any question of dividing the hoard in such shares as has been planned. Yet a 14th share of all the silver and gold was given up to Bard, for Dane honored the agreement of the dead. From the treasure, Bard sent much gold to the master of Lake Town. He wished to reward Bilbo most richly, but Bilbo refused, and in the end he would only take two small chests, one filled with silver and the other with gold. Bilbo and Gandalf rode behind the elven king, and beside them strode Beorn. Though elves turned and entered Mirkwood, the others took the long way around the forest's north end. Bilbo had many hardships and adventures before he got back. He and Gandalf stayed at Beorn's over the winter and passed through Rivendell, where he learned where Gandalf had been to, a council of white wizards who had at last driven the necromancer from his dark hold in the south of Mirkwood. They dug up the gold of the trolls which they had buried a year earlier, and came at last in sight of the country where Bilbo had been born and bred, where the shapes of the land and the trees were as well known to him as his hands and his toes. The last stage. An unexpected return. As they came back to Bilbo's own door, there was a great commotion, and people of all sorts were going in and out. If he was surprised, they were more surprised still. He had arrived back in the middle of an auction. Bilbo was presumed dead, and his effects were being sold. It was quite a long time before Bilbo was admitted to be alive again, and in the end, he had to buy back a lot of his own furniture. One autumn evening, some years afterward, Bilbo was paid a visit by Gandalf and Balin. Through them, Bilbo learned how things were going in the land of the mountain. Bard had rebuilt Dale, and all the valley had become tilled and rich again. Lake Town was refounded. The old master had come to a bad end. He fell under the dragon's sickness and took most of the gold Bard had given the Lake Town and fled with it, and died of starvation in the waste. The new master was of a wiser kind. From the time of his unexpected return, Bilbo was held by all the hobbits of the neighborhood to be queer. Bilbo did not mind. He was quite content. He swore his sword he hung over the mantelpiece. His coat of mail was arranged on a stand by the wall. His magic ring he kept a great secret, for he chiefly used it when unpleasant callers came. He took to writing poetry and visiting the elves, and though few believed any of his tales, he remained very happy to the end of his days, and those were extraordinarily long. Whew. All right, guys. That was, not going to lie, that was a lot of reading for me to go through there. So I'm going to keep it short at the end here. If you enjoyed these Lord of the Rings cards, leave a comment, like the video, subscribe. This is Card Corner doing these Hobbit 36 color trading cards. I think that was pretty much the whole Hobbit adventure. I hope you enjoyed it. Take it easy.